I should say at the outset of this actually started, I don't know when Jim and I had the first discussion, at least half a dozen years ago, about the possibility of being able to reach into the clinical sample stream of kind of everything flowing through UW-Medicine and making specimens available, specimens from our patients available for the purposes of research in order to, of course, better understand their disease and be able to treat it more effectively. It became possible, really, with some funding, well, with a couple of things. One is the overhaul of the electronic medical record system that Jim has been doing with his second hat as Chief of Informatics for UW-Medicine. But then also funding from the Life Sciences Discovery Fund that actually allowed us to undertake the work to develop the infrastructure that would be needed to achieve the goal. There's an obvious need and interest for a resource of this kind. And we aren't the first academic medical center to get into this. But we are kind of the first in terms of doing the entire array, the broad array of work that I'm going to be describing to you and the eventual capabilities of this system that actually benefit from really kind of two separate efforts that have been brought together to result in the system that we'll eventually have. We did monitor particularly this part that we'll be talking about that uses liquid specimens that flow through the laboratory medicine portion of the system after the Harvard system that has been developed that's called Crimson. And as you can see here, that's become an important part of the research of several investigators at Harvard. This slide is actually several years old at this point, and at that time it was supporting about $30 million of research a year. And actually, one of the things that it did that convinced us that it would be valuable to do this was for research where specimens of this sort are needed, and they're needed in large volume. It tremendously increased the efficiency. It decreased the cost of investigators getting these specimens by about 2 orders of magnitude. And because one could work through a system that was already set up that saw patients and had specimens flowing through, could also greatly speed the efficiency with which you could actually identify specimens and get them into the hands of researchers. The challenge of doing this was actually assembling several components, and of course you could immediately see why the informatics are very important. I'll talk a little bit about the issues of consent and permissioning in a way that will approach this, but that also is kind of another important step, I think, available or that we'd be taking on behalf of the healthcare system. But once we have a patient who can be characterized by the phenotype, really, of the disease, and we can find that in individual through systems like Amalga, and identify the available specimens, obviously we need to link that all together with an informatics cables that allow us to look into the system and then to notify laboratories, both laboratory medicine and pathology, of the specimens that are actually of interest. The honest broker is a thing that I won't speak about a whole lot here, but really that individual is the one who is the interface, and you can almost view it in one part as the service window. If an investigator seeks a certain set of samples, they can describe that set of samples essentially by describing inclusion and exclusion criteria to this individual and honest broker, who can then turn around and look into the electronic medical record systems and determine whether or not we have patients in the system flowing through, whose specimens are flowing through the system that meet those inclusion and exclusion criteria. And if they are, the second question that we'll go into a little bit here is whether or not the patients will have granted permission or consented to the use of those specimens for research. And that's been an important feature of this system that we've been working to build. And if those two criteria are met, then get those specimens either from laboratory medicine or from anatomic pathology, actually, if they're available at that site and they're solid specimens. This has been from the very beginning the work of a very large team. Dave Chu has been involved throughout. Jeff Beard, who's here I see today, we can blame some of this on him as well. And Sandy, I'm told that you are beyond all blame, and we shan't blame you, and only thank you for the good things that you've done with this. But this has improved a large informatics team, community outreach, people in the health system that have been working on the consenting and permissioning systems that we'll put in place, and then of course both lab medicine and pathology. I should also acknowledge a lot of work from people at the Hutch, and principally among those Peggy Porter and Barb Stein, who's here as well. Although you're on the CBR team, and that was a WPBR slide, and I'm sure you'll forgive me for having made that little boo-boo. Patients first, of course, is something that you hear around UW Medicine all the time, and it's not a slogan. It's actually the thing that we considered first as we were developing this system. You've heard me talk about the permissioning system, and while it would be legal and actually permissible, and many other health centers, academic and private health centers, actually do simply use discarded specimens without a patient's permission. We thought that it was particularly important to maintain the trust of patients and maintain the trust of the public such that they would be informed and ask for permission in order to be able to use their specimens after they've been used for whatever clinical purpose they were obtained for research. And so the system has been built with this in mind. It was actually just circumstantial that the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, came out right at about the time we were beginning this work, and it was very informative. We were certainly convinced of the path we were already on, but had we not been, this would have certainly convinced us to make sure that people were informed and consented to everything that went on. A lot of work has been done in terms of community engagement to inform them about this work, the value of the work, the value of their phenotype specimens in the research context. We actually began the work by revising the UW Medicine and actually then the University of Washington's human tissue policy. And these bulleted points are really what we ended up with. One big change from between what the policy had been and what the policy currently is that we can, under the new policy, make these specimens, either from laboratory medicine or anatomic pathology, available to for-profit institutions. And previously, the policy had not allowed that to happen. We want to do that because of the importance, of course, of biospecimens in a variety of things, developing new diagnostics, for example, or new therapeutics. The key point is that any entity that we would make these specimens available to cannot turn around and sell them. UW maintains ownership, so if we think that they're violating the parameters around which specimens have been made available to them, they can be recalled. We will not retain any kind of IP property rights in these things, and they are required to share data as we would through NIH policies. Let me go into just a little bit of the resource overview. The goal, obviously, as you might already know from what you might have heard just in the scuttlebutt about this, we're about a year into the process of building it, is actually to build a fully integrated, web-accessible, ethical, sustainable, statewide phenotype biospecimen resource that would make these specimens available to researchers certainly throughout the state date, and possibly even more broadly than that. One of the features of this will be to actually make available these permitted specimens, permission having to do with of course, asking the patient about that. But they will be available in really kind of two scenarios. One, de-identified. The advantage to the investigator in terms of obtaining de-identified specimens is they can simply place an order for the sort of specimen that they want. We can turn around, we can grab that, take all the patient identifying characteristics off of the specimens and make them available. Alternatively, with an IRB-approved protocol, an individual could identify at least data, and under some conditions with IRB approval, identify patients for further research as they would acquire these specimens. They'll be phenotyped by clinical history, and the variety of specimens that are listed here will also be available. Eventually, the way this system will work is that the eventual total goal will be achieved by integrating two separate systems that are actually being built in parallel and really by the same teams. A lot of crossover between the two builds. The first one started by a Life Sciences Discovery grant that was obtained by Peggy Porter at the Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. And this one had the characteristics of really being cancer only. It was going to focus principally on tumor biopsies or tumors attained at surgery. And from the get-go on this, in the IRB parlance, they were going to be prospectively acquired. So at the time the specimen was acquired, it was going to know that a portion of this, it was going to be known that a portion of this would actually be used for research. And that, of course, would have required informed consent in order to use the specimens in that way. In some cases, they would have a paired blood sample, but the blood sample would also be taken and simply processed in parallel with that specimen. And those were the principal features of the CBR, the Cancer Biospecimen Repository. On this, the WPBR, the Washington Phenotype Biospecimen Repository, the big thing that we were trying to do is capitalize on the CBR, extend this to all disease states, not just cancer, be able to build out a more robust system that would capture discarded specimens as well as those that might be gained or might be obtained specifically for research, take advantage of multiple specimen streams at the multiple sites, and lab medicine is a very good example of that, and achieve the de-identification for work where the large amount of work actually where de-identification is useful. And one of the things that I think most of you recognize that if you do de-identify the specimens, then they actually don't. Then you can avoid having to go through the IRB in order to actually obtain the specimens in order to use them for research. And that's while they would still be permitted by the patient, the investigator has nothing to do with that and would actually be able to avoid having to take a tour through IRB land, which I'm sure everyone appreciates. So the different specimen resources are actually highlighted in this slide, and you can see the Cancer Biospecimen Repository right here having a few different aspects. And one of the aspects that I haven't talked about is actually the virtual biospecimen repository. And what this is an intent in a system using software that was developed by Harvard in their Crimson system called Daedalus. And the Daedalus system actually keeps an inventory that's up to date of all the specimens in the various different biorepositories that exist for tumor specimens. And so that actually then, that inventory can be made available online to researchers who can request specimens out of those individual repositories from a central site. And then what we have talked about is a prospective specimen collection patient who would be going into surgery, for example, consented to allow at the point that the specimen is processed in the cold sectioning laboratory to divert a portion of it to research from the very beginning, and then the rest of it to be used for clinical diagnostic purposes. What's regarded here is labeled as high throughput. Blood specimen capture could also be true for anatomic pathology with solid specimens, and this would certainly be from routine clinical procedures where specimens are obtained without the first intent to have them used for research, but as an investigator would identify or would come up with a research need, can approach this honest broker in terms of requesting certain specimens, and this is where we simply reach into a flowing specimen stream, actually within anatomic pathology or laboratory medicine. What we're going to really have at the end of this in terms of the coverage is for cancer and all other disease status categories, or all other diseases in IRB status of either prospectively collected for research or the discarded sample specimens. We're going to have wonderful coverage in terms of cancer. With what we're going to be able to do in this phase of building, we're going to be quite strong in other diseases for the discard specimens, and we'll probably be a little bit less strong in terms of what we're going to be able to afford, accomplish with current funding in terms of the prospective collection for diseases other than cancer. The intent is, though, to keep up with the initiative that's already underway and eventually build that out to full strength. What's shown on this slide is really kind of the way the system will work. From the patient's perspective, they will simply experience the healthcare system as they always have done, with really just one change. And that is, at some point when they encounter our system, and the way that we see this is, for example, in the ambulatory care clinics, as they first walk up to the clinic, they will be, brochures will be available in order to explain this resource, the protections afforded to them, and the uses to which their specimens might be put. But they will be asked a few simple questions, and that would be, number one, is it okay with you if we use the remaining portion of your specimen collected for clinical purposes for research, essentially, rather than throw it away? The second question would be, is it okay with you if we use clinical data obtained from you for the purposes of research? And the third question actually would be, might you be interested in participating in clinical trials? And I think you can see the obvious utility of all of these questions. The third one we're particularly doesn't relate directly simply to the biospecimen streams and what we've been talking about so far. But I think many of you recognize that if you open a clinical trial, one of your biggest problems is identifying patients who are appropriate for that trial and getting them placed on trial. So this would kind of use the mechanisms that are built within this system in order to identify patients who would be interested in being contacted and invited to participate in a trial that might be appropriate for their condition. So it will have one feature then beyond actually just collecting the biospecimens for research purposes. So the patient just then kind of continues with their normal clinical visit to the point at which tissue or blood is obtained, goes through anatomic pathology, lab medicine, and ends up here in terms of the residual case eventually being held prior to being discarded. From the standpoint of the investigator, if they want de-identified specimens, they are simply interacting with this honest broker in order to essentially place an order that would be defined by the number of specimens they want, the type, and the clinical inclusion and exclusion categories. And this, of course, being entered into the informatics system, as would the authorization or the consent up here, in order to eventually be able able to be linked with an electronic medical record and linked with specimens flowing through the system such that an order can go out to anatomic pathology or laboratory medicine in order to collect certain specimens for research use, or such that people who are employed by this system can go to the appropriate location and pick up the samples once they've expired, once they're beyond their hold dates for clinical purposes. I'm going to skip through a whole bunch of things here, but the information challenges have been to link permission status, the research specimen, with the electronic medical record to make sure we're looking for the right specimens, and then to determine their availability. I won't go into this at all, but it gets a lot more complex than even this slide suggests, and well beyond the point at which I'm able to deal with it. The impact on the patient experience I've really already discussed. The front desk folks essentially at the clinics would be looking at their EPIC screens, would put these 3 questions to patients as they come in, record answers, either yes or no as they're obtained, and then they're integrated into the system. An important feature about this is actually the status of permission that a patient will have granted us. It will not be readily accessible at all to physicians by whom they're being treated. And this we thought was an important feature so that we could promise patients that the answers to the questions that they give here would not at all affect their clinical care. So we can, while we can't imagine that it would, we can also guarantee that most effectively if we can actually also say that they're hidden from the individuals who are delivering your care. Another thing that has been undertaken, really as we've proceeded through this, is to develop a uniform consenting procedure for obtaining these specimens. And I mentioned this just a little while ago. Not too long ago, we actually discovered that there were about 5 different consents that were being used at SCCA for various collections that were somewhat similar to this for specific tumor types by specific PIs. And as you can imagine, with the front desk folks, that can get just a little bit confusing. So what we've undertaken to do, and actually with the strong interest of our Human Subjects Division and actually eventually with IRBs, is to develop a single consent form that will put these 3 questions to patients as they're encountering our systems. And this consent form is right now not much more than a page long. Okay, and so any of you, and that's many in this audience, that have done informed consent know that these documents can run very long. We all understand that the longer they get, the less a patient or a research subject understands. And this is a wonderful concerted effort to cut down a consent form to where it's easy language, short, and simple to understand. And then, of course, something that becomes reasonable to administer to a patient as they're contacting the system actually or encountering our system for clinical care. The planned communications is actually through websites and through materials that will be available around UW Medicine and most likely SCCA. And they will be in a variety of systems. The things that were most important to us in terms of studies that we've done so far is some brochures that will go into a little bit more detail than the consent form actually will, and something that a patient will be able to take with them. And think about this if they're not ready to answer the questions at the first time that they experience the system. The impact on the healthcare system is really not too terribly great, unless you happen to be working in the healthcare system, I guess, and I'm not, so I can say things like that. And that is, I mean, there's certainly an impact in laboratory medicine. I haven't listed that here. There's certainly an impact in anatomic pathology. The third impact is really those individuals who are administering the consent at the front desks. They're going to be using EPIC at this point. We have thought about actually doing this at blood draw sites associated with laboratory medicine. One of the challenges there is actually that EPIC isn't available at those sites. Don't for a moment think that any of this would be hatched on you guys without an awful lot of discussion in determining whether or not it would actually work well in that particular site. But it's actually a site that makes an awful lot of intuitive sense. The patient going then to that site as a specimen is being collected and asked whether or not it's okay to use the residual amount for research. We're obviously going to be selective, and certainly a consent system like this would not appear in emergency departments. So we've done a little bit of work actually using SCCA as a pilot site and that arm of laboratory medicine there. And this was really to test several of the components that had been built, to look at the consenting process that's used at SCCA, which is a little bit different. It's actually a paper consent form rather than in the system that we would use with EPIC that would capture a signature electronically. But it uses, beyond that, a lot of the same IT infrastructure that would be used within UW medicine. And depends on matching patient characteristics and identifying the appropriate samples for collection. So this tested the consent process at SCCA, the operations and the IT sides of that, required connectivity between several different electronic systems that had to be worked out, and was, of course, part of the effort that Stephen and others have been engaged, and went through training of the personnel who would be involved in doing this, and allowed us to estimate at a very first early initial test how successful we could be in terms of retrieving specimens from the system. This is just a little bit of a depiction. I don't think I'll actually go through it, that demonstrates the kind of different layers, but this process, the test went over a period of 2 weeks, and eventually we were able to collect specimens obtained for a variety of different purposes, and the metrics that came out of that, the data that came out of that, was that of the patients who were approached for consent, 63% completed the paper forms that they were given. Some never returned those forms. Other forms that were turned in were invalid. They couldn't be interpreted. A few patients were not approached, and a few patients that would have been approached for consent could not be because they didn't show up. If you add all these numbers up, you're missing about 20%. Those are the folks that were handed a piece of paper, were in the clinic, but never turned the piece of paper back in, which is fine. Of those that completed the form, about 95% consented to have their specimens collected for research, and that's actually a pretty good rate. We collected about 479 samples, and the overall accuracy in terms of identification was about 71%. So there were specimens that we knew that were in the system, but we went and essentially tried to put our hands on them at the appropriate time. We were about 71% successful. This actually, to us, I think if you guys look at it from laboratory medicine, you'd say that's not good enough. At the first step in terms of building out a system like this and doing the initial test, we were actually very encouraged by that. Some of the reasons actually, and the principal reason really for not being able to get a higher capture rate is really because some of the specimens were discarded at the time that we went around actually to collect them, so it was kind of a misunderstanding in terms of the period of time that they would be retained and then would be available in order to be picked up once they were actually identified. So these things and many of the reasons are pretty easily fixable, and we expect to be able to do that, and of course are undertaking that work now. So I had meant this not to be a terribly long presentation, and I think I've hit that mark. Really what we'd like to do, we have several folks that have been involved with this effort to this point present, and I'd like to throw it open for any questions that you folks have or concerns that you'd like to raise. Yes?
I have a question about that. 3 questions you asked the patients.
Yes.
Can you put that slide? Okay, so on question 2, is it implied or not that the medical record part is also de-identified?
It could be. So it's a yes and no. So the question is, sorry, I need to repeat the question. Would the medical record data be de-identified? It would be if an IRB approval, so you didn't have an IRB approved protocol to actually have patient-specific information, HIPAA-protected information made available. In all other cases, it would be de-identified. And in most of the specimens that when we talked about the discarded stream, flowing through, we would anticipate being to characterize the specimen from the medical record, but all patient identifiers would be stripped before a specimen is handed out. And so we'd be using the medical record in order to identify the appropriate specimen, but none of that information in a patient-specific way would ever be handed out. You would simply know that you got 100 or 1,000 blood specimens that fit your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and that would be it. Larry? Yep.
Yeah. I assume multiple investigators want the same specimen. How do you decide who should get it?
Yeah, we anticipate.
What happens about amount of specimen?
Yeah, we expect that to be a problem, a larger problem with anatomic pathology solid specimens. They are with the liquid specimens, blood specimens, and that sort of thing. There is a group actually set up in Peggy's system, and Peggy is sitting right back there with Steve Schmeckel, who will be very much involved with this as well, that will determine based on scientific priority which investigator would get these specimens. It's not, as you realize, an easy question to answer in the abstract. And what we want to do is get maximum utility for the best science and clinical need out of each specimen that we make available. So a panel of individuals will have to make that determination. Peggy, you want to add to that?
Well, I really add what we've been doing, especially in the breast repository, breast cancer repository, is that we try to make every specimen stretch as far as possible. So if someone wants sections off of those, if someone wants a certain amount that they can get RNA out, we try to keep the specimens, the blocks and what they are, intact as long as we can, but giving out as much as we can. So I think with some judicious use of certain specimens, we will be able to supply most needs, and that's pretty much been true for a lot of the cancer.
So I have to repeat that, sorry for the TV thing. Peggy's answer was, Peggy will correct me, of course, that each specimen from the breast cancer repository experience right now where these questions are encountered, each specimen is maximum use is made of each specimen. The individuals controlling the repository work with the various investigators in order to determine their true need. Dissect the specimen as needed in order to be able to meet all of those needs and try to retain the largest fraction intact in the repository that they can so that it's put to the best use. Larry?
Are we dealing with frozen specimens or blocks of parafilm?
It could be either. The question was, sorry, frozen or blocks of paraffin, and it could be either. It could be in any form at all. Yes?
So I have 2 questions. One is, will there be prioritization for UW or SCC or the Washington investigators over outside investigators or commercial users?
Yes.
So that's one question. And the second question is, how do you annotate the specimen when there's an infinite number of things that people might ask? How does that work?
Well, so let me take the first. Will UW and SCCA, or excuse me, UW and Hutch investigators who are part of the Cancer Consortium use those in state? And the answer to that is yes. We are very serious about making the specimens available to investigators at other institutions. And when we do have conflict, really the scientific priority question will have to be answered. And frankly, if that came to be somebody at another institution, in order to be true to those principles, we'd have to make it available to those individuals. I'm not too worried about that at this point. The mass of investigators are actually here, the Hutch, and in this general community. But we are serious about making them available on a scientific priority basis so that we fulfill the promise to the patients in terms of making best use. Your second question was about annotation. As a pathologist, you're going to be able to answer that question better than I can. That was scary. So it depends on the use. And we've worked a lot with Larry True, and Steve Schmeckel has been involved with this sort of work at Minnesota. And about the only way that I can answer that, actually, is that the level of annotation is eventually going to have to be appropriate to the intended use. And if these were to be, for example, anatomic pathology specimens, then one might actually have to interact and collaborate very closely with the pathologist in order to get that done most appropriately for the specific questions that are being asked. And other questions, so you can imagine some research where it would be very important to have that very finely defined, and other sorts of research where it might be possible entirely from the medical record. Yes?
I think this is a terrific opportunity. I love the idea of a consolidated consent that's simplified for everybody. One of the questions I have is what you envision for long-term storage of specimens, since it seems like a real advantage potentially is to know the outcome. In a sense, we want to be predictive, but we need to have a bank of specimens.
Yeah. So the question is about long-term storage, and this has always come up. And there's a rich guy in town, or a few rich guys in town, and they don't have enough money to buy all the freezers to store all the specimens that you folks would want to store. And so really, the only thing that we can do is, and what this is built to do, is to retrieve specimens at a low-cost, efficient way. And get them out to investigators, and it can be used to feed biorepositories that any group might want to keep. But we can't be operating the freezers for you. We saw no way to do that. One follow-up here.
The corollary might be, is there a way to go back and look at the retained specimens and say what was the outcome 6 months later? And so this is partly keeping the link, but keeping them de-identified.
I might not understand that question well enough. A question about being able to retain samples and go back and look at clinical outcome. Of course, one of the reasons you can easily imagine research projects where you are looking at some characteristic in the specimen and eventually following the record in order to be able to look at outcome. Even in a de-identified case in this example, you would be able to follow a given patient serially without ever knowing who that patient was, simply by unique numbers that would be attached to specimens as they are made available to you. So yes, this would be able to accommodate that sort of research. Question in front here?
Yeah, two questions. Actually, I'll follow up on Mark's question. So I understand the physical limitations financial limitations of being able to provide freezers, but how about...
As Vice Dean for Research, thank you for understanding that. You're the only person in this place that does.
How about hard drives? So if, say, an investigator wanted to set up a biorepository to house the specimens, will you still centrally house the data associated with those specimens?
Yeah, so that's so the question is, if an investigator wanted to centrally house and run the freezer part of a biospecimen repository himself, a biorepository, would there be software available and data storage space in order to keep a record of, I guess, both what's in that repository and some of the results associated with that. And that's part of what Peggy and her group are building out right now in their virtual repository system that I spoke just briefly about here. Yes?
There are situations where investigators have approval to get an identified sample on a subject, and so would your system allow for that? In other words, if they have that permission, can the specimen be passed back to them with the patient?
Yeah, so the question was, could an investigator identify essentially by name a particular patient who was in the system and obtain a specimen from that patient? And the answer to that is yes, but of course you need IRB approval, and then of course we'd have patient consent for that as well. So it could be used to do that. And one of the features that I could actually see building into this at some point would be that if one were doing genetic studies and discard specimens, for example, and a blood specimen was appropriate for the study that you were doing, and discard specimens were inappropriate because you were concerned about the chemical stability of the analyte, that you were eventually looking at. We, in working and building out such a system with lab medicine, might be able to develop a situation where a patient could be identified on the basis of their electronic medical record, permission status that they would be interested in participating in a clinical study or trial, having been checked yes, being able then to reach out and contact an individual and ask them if they might come by to, for example, up here in the hospital, the clinical blood draw area, in order to have a blood specimen drawn specifically for this research project and arrange for the eventual, spin and hold or quick workup for that, so that an investigator could either have the samples sent to them or eventually come by and pick them up. So once we have the basic electronic infrastructure and this basic thing built, we would be able to add on features like that I think could be tremendously useful. Steve?
From the lofty heights of the Vice Dean's office and neighboring offices, metrics for success. What do you want to see come from this? I realize you're midstream. High impact papers, grant dollars. What would trigger your decision to say, wow, this went great, we need to invest X further in this process?
Boy, that was nice. You put the further investment of dollars coming out of my pocket someplace right at the end of that, and that was very nicely and deftly done. I think, yeah, smiles on the question was what metric would cause me to think about this thing was success. The obvious one would be the simple volume of use. And that it success in terms of patient acceptance, with the bit of a change, being asked about using these specimens for research, their satisfaction with that, volume of use, investigators' satisfaction with the way the thing actually operates. And certainly we should also be able to identify work that simply couldn't be undertaken without an efficient, low-cost access to large numbers of clinical specimens. So while I haven't really thought very much previously about how we'd specifically define that, right now I think the definition is we get a system that works. But whether or not it was all worthwhile will be characterized, I think, by those things that I just mentioned. If everybody in this room is smiling, I'll be ever so pleased. And we'll see about future money. What do I know about that?
Yeah. Will the consent allow NIH-DB gap certification?
Yes. It has to. Yeah. Oh, well, the consent allow NIH-DB gap certification, yes, it has to. Sorry.
And what is that?
The DB-GAP is the NIH database of phenotype and genotype, and if you're doing NIH-funded research that is genomic sequencing, then you have to deposit it And the consent has to tell the patient that it will be deposited in a scientific database and the risk associated with that.
Other questions? Yes? Oh, right here in front.
I wanted to ask about the electronic medical record searching and how robust you actually think that is right now to identify, for instance, some obscure disease or even common diseases, and how easy is it actually going to be able to provide specimens that people really want?
That is going to be a challenge. The quality. The question was about the quality of the electronic medical record to actually be able to adequately define both the patient in terms of a phenotype and link it tightly enough. Well, the link to the specimen will always be there, but the question is actually going to be about the phenotype of the specimen that I've obtained. I think in some cases, the electronic medical record alone might be sufficient in order to do that identification. I think in other instances, particularly those that at this point rely upon natural language notes and that sort of thing in order to be interpreted. It won't work well enough now as at the time we start this. But of course, as I think many people here realize, natural language processing work is continuing and will eventually have to be part of the system that not just the electronic medical record system that all healthcare organizations have. I think as progress is made in that regard, the electronic medical record will be more useful for this. And in the interim, I think what would happen here is that the electronic medical record would be useful for identifying those patients that seem to be the correct patients. And then it might take further interactions with those patients under an informed consent protocol in order to determine whether or not they actually truly manifest the characteristics that are of interest to the research. Yes?
I'm wondering about the duration and durability of the consent. Is it consent for the patient's life? Is it for an encounter? Is it for a particular blood draw?
So the question was about the durability of the consent, and is it for the patients as long as the patient might live and being interacting with our health system or for a specific blood draw. We intend for a patient at any point to be able to revoke consent. So they will be able to contact us. The contact information that they would be given would be for the honest broker. And that person can essentially go back into the system and flip a yes to a no anytime the patient asks for that to be done. What they'll be told was that for specimens that might have been, particularly those that are de-identified, right, and have gone out to investigators, we will not be able to retrieve those. And you can easily imagine why we simply couldn't do that. But right from that point, any specimen that would be retrieved would not be available for research. Yes?
And will the consent apply to specimens that are obtained after the patient passes away, as from postmortem sampling?
At this point, we have been considering that question, and I can't say that we fully answered it. The initial kind of tip point is no, because of the issues of next of kin. But it's still a question that we're wrestling with, and we'd love to have your input into that.
You know my email.
Yes. Yes?
I was curious a little bit about the details, since one of the basic premises here is that these are discarded specimens. So what constitutes, or the definition of discarded, I guess, really depends on when the lab says, okay, it's not feasible for any additional.
Yeah, that just takes advantage of standard laboratory protocol right now, and it takes the point at which that specimen is declared medical waste and is going to go to an incinerator to be disposed of, would be the point at which it becomes available for these purposes when we talk about discarded specimens. But when we talk about prospectively collected specimens, of course, they can be obtained much earlier after the point of collection, and for much research, those are going to be the more valuable specimens. But this system, this combined system, will enable and make more efficient and cheaper those collections as well.
And the level of detail for investigators studying specific analytes, for example, stability issues, was it stored for 26 hours at 4 degrees and kept at room temp? what would be available?
So the question has to do with the conditions of storage. And we'd be able to characterize those, and laboratory medicine could right now, for systems that have run through, for specimens that run through their system and then go in the refrigerator at the end of the analytical, kind of assembly line right now. And then they're going to be stored there at 4 degrees for 2 or 3 days, whatever that is, and then taken, perhaps frozen, and perhaps shipped or held, for an individual, the laboratory personnel to come by and pick them up. When you get into the things that might be prospectively collected, those might actually have to be done, and some of the cancer specimens that are being collected now with specific protocols associated to the collection of that specimen for the particular purpose. And then those are really, that's where this gets extremely customizable for the need of the specific research. And of course, the more customized it gets, the more labor intensive it gets, and then of course cost of specimens goes up. Yes? Yeah, Jeff?
Could you just clarify a little bit, because you talked a little bit about discarded specimens, but there are some sorts of specimens that we never discard practically if we keep them for 20 years or something. I'm thinking of paraffin blocks, definitely. So sometimes they're never discarded. So. Well,
yeah, so let me answer this to the best of my ability, okay? And that would be, I understand that some specimen blocks are, the question about paraffin blocks that are kept indefinitely. We cannot invade a sample that is kept for some medical purpose. And some of those specimens kept in the blocks are kept for those reasons. We can only use something without a specific patient consent to using something that's not medical waste if we've gotten that permission from the patient. And so I think that's as well as I can actually answer that. Yes?
I have a question about sustaining the infrastructure required to retrieve specimens, de-identify them, and so on. Is the thought that the indirect from grants would then be feeding into?
No, we actually, in order for this to work, the fees that are actually charged for specimens, and this, of course, will be obtained at a fee. Harvard's able to put out de-identified blood specimens from the clinical stream, so the medical waste blood specimens, for something, this goes back a couple of years now, but about $12 per specimen. And so we expect these things to be available fairly cheaply, but the costs that we can recover from that are going to have to come very close to covering the cost of the systems. It might be possible to offer some central subsidy, but there is not enough central money to run all the things that we might choose to run, want to run with a central subsidy. So it does have to be run cost efficiently and cover its costs. So, and in that regard too, of course, we'll never be in the point of selling a specimen. But when the specimen is transferred, there'll be a fee associated with that, and that fee will be appropriate simply to cover the cost of running the system and maintaining that infrastructure, and not anything that's generating any kind of slush fund to be used for any other purpose. Yes?
About is this currently active? Is it the timelines or time frames?
Point is, when it becomes active, Mark guarantees it, it'll be roughly a year from now. We've got one more year on the LSDF fundings in both of the different grants. So we better be ready. I said it out loud. Okay, thank you very much.